Between 1884 and 1885, 4 coffins left the Villa Dingler in Panama. Jules Dingler was the chief engineer of the French Panama Canal project. He buried his daughter first, dead of yellow fever, then his son, then his daughter's fiancé, then his wife. All 4 gone inside 12 months. Dingler himself survived, physically. He returned to France a broken man and died 2 years later. 22,000 more workers followed the Dinglers into Panamanian graves before the French company declared bankruptcy in 1889. When the Americans arrived 21 years later, the Villa Dingler was still standing, empty, with the piano inside. What they learned when they opened that door changed how every major construction project of the next 120 years would be organized. This is the story of 3 men, 102 steam shovels, and the system that cut a continent in 2. We show you first why the French died, then how a railroad engineer from Maine redefined the problem, then how an army of 6,000 men worked in the Culebra Gorge, and finally what happened to the only machine from that era that still exists today. Ferdinand de Lesseps was the most celebrated engineer in Europe. He had cut the Suez Canal through the Egyptian desert between 1859 and 1869, and the world called it the achievement of the century. In 1881, he brought his Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique to Panama with a simple plan. He would cut a sea-level canal through the isthmus using French steam dredges and French engineering. The plan assumed the Chagres River could be tamed. It could not. The plan assumed tropical disease could be managed with 19th century medicine. It could not. The plan assumed that Panamanian rock would behave like Egyptian sand. It did not. Between 1881 and 1889, the French spent $287 million. In modern terms, $8 billion of 19th century capital, much of it raised from small French investors who mortgaged their savings to buy shares. When the bankruptcy came, those families lost everything. The Panama scandal that followed destroyed multiple political careers in the French Parliament. But the real cost was in bodies. 22,000 workers died during the French effort. Yellow fever killed them in Ancon Hospital, where the bed legs stood in bowls of water to keep ants off the patients, and where the standing water became perfect mosquito breeding grounds. Malaria killed them in the camps. Pneumonia killed them in the wet barracks. John Findley Wallace was the first American chief engineer. He was a railroad man, 42 years old, and he had built the Illinois Central's St. Louis division. He arrived in Panama in June of 1904, walked through the abandoned French camps, saw the rusting equipment and the overgrown cemeteries, and understood immediately that this job would probably kill him. He ordered a metal coffin shipped from the United States to his house in Panama and told his wife where he wanted to be buried. This was standard procedure for white Americans in the Canal Zone during those first months. Nobody expected to come home. Wallace lasted 14 months. He quit in July of 1905, exhausted and ashamed, and returned to the United States on the first available steamer. He had barely moved any dirt. The equipment he inherited from the French was underpowered, the workforce was dying, and the Chagres River flooded his works every rainy season. His replacement was a man named John Frank Stevens, and he saw something that Wallace had missed. Stevens was a railroad engineer who had built James J. Hill's Great Northern across Marias Pass in Montana, widely regarded as the best construction man in America. When Theodore Roosevelt personally asked him to take the Panama job, Stevens agreed only on the condition that he would have complete authority. Roosevelt wrote him a single sentence of instruction: "Make the dirt fly." Stevens arrived in July of 1905 and spent his first 3 weeks doing nothing but walking the line, studying the terrain, measuring grades, and counting the derelict French equipment. Then he stopped the digging. Every shovel, every dredge, every pick and shovel gang was ordered to halt. Stevens had seen the French mistake, and he had seen Wallace's mistake, and he understood them as a single problem. The Panama Canal was not primarily a digging project. It was a transportation project. Every shovel full of dirt the French had lifted had gone onto a pile next to the shovel because the French did not have a working railroad to move the spoil away. When the pile got too big, the shovel was stuck. Stevens said it plainly. The digging is the least thing of all. He spent the next 18 months rebuilding the Panama Railroad from the ground up. He ordered 120 Mogul locomotives from Alcocook at $11,307 each, all built to the 5-foot Panama gauge, all oil-fired, all with sloped tenders for running in reverse through the narrow cuts. He ordered 2,300 dirt spoil cars. He widened the roadbed, installed double tracks in the Culebra Cut, and built a spur system that would feed shovels and remove dirt in a continuous loop. At peak, 160 dirt trains ran every day in the cut, one every 9 minutes, with absolute priority over all other traffic. While Stevens rebuilt the railroad, William Crawford Gorgas went after the mosquitoes. Gorgas was an army doctor who had wiped out yellow fever in Havana after the Spanish-American War. He knew the disease vector. He knew the cure. He also knew that the Isthmian Canal Commission bureaucrats in Washington thought his program was a waste of money. In 1904 and 1905, Washington denied his requests for funding 3 separate times. One commissioner famously called the mosquito theory a fad. Roosevelt eventually overruled them personally, and the money was released. Gorgas persisted. He fumigated every building in Colon and Panama City with pyrethrum and sulfur. He drained standing water everywhere he could find it, including the pools under the hospital beds. He sent teams of inspectors house by house, screening windows, oiling cisterns, burning out mosquito nests. He distributed quinine to every worker every morning. By December of 1906, the last yellow fever case in Panama was recorded. In the first half of 1906, the peak of the epidemic, 82.1% of the American workforce was hospitalized for malaria at some point during the year. By 1914, worker mortality had dropped by 99.9% compared to the French period. Gorgas did that, nobody else. The same man would leave Panama years later to fight pneumonia in South African gold mines, because pneumonia, not yellow fever, remained the leading killer across the entire construction period. If you're finding this helpful, hit like and subscribe. We cover the engineering stories behind the machines that built our world every few days. Now let's look at what happened when Theodore Roosevelt fired John Stevens and replaced him with a soldier. Stevens resigned in early 1907. The exact reason has never been fully explained, but he wrote to Roosevelt that the work had become unbearable, and Roosevelt took the resignation personally. He decided that the next chief engineer would be an Army officer on orders. Colonel George Washington Goethals of the United States Army Corps of Engineers arrived in April of 1907. He was 48 years old. He had never run a civilian construction project, and he immediately made it clear that he was not there to manage workers. He was there to command them. Goethals reorganized the entire canal into 3 divisions, each run by an Army engineer. The Atlantic Division handled Gatun Dam and the Gatun Locks. The Pacific Division handled the Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks. The Central Division, the hardest assignment, handled the Culebra Cut and was given to Colonel David Dubos Gaillard. When the Cucaracha Slide in October of 1907 dumped 500,000 cubic yard of mud into the cut, Gaillard asked Goethals what to do. Goethals looked at him and said, "Hell, dig it out again." That was how he ran the canal. No committee meetings, no compromise, no pause. Dig it out again. By 1909, the system was running at full speed. 102 steam shovels operated simultaneously. 77 Bucyrus shovels were built in South Milwaukee. 24 Marion shovels were built 15 miles down the road in Marion, Ohio. One through shovel came from Lorain, Ohio. Each shovel weighed 95 tons and carried a 5 cubic yard dipper. Each operated with a crew of 4 men plus 6 ground workers who constantly laid and relaid the rails beneath the machine. A shovel operator earned between $210 and $240 per month. That made him the highest paid skilled worker on the entire project, earning more than locomotive engineers, more than iron workers, more than machinists. He got free housing and free medical care. We covered the Bucyrus Erie Company in detail in a previous video, including how the Panama contract made them the dominant force in heavy equipment for the next century. That video traces the full arc from Daniel Eales's $17,000 foundry purchase in 1880 to Caterpillar's $8.6 billion acquisition in 2011. What we focus on here is the system around the shovels, because the shovels alone would never have moved 96 million cubic yards of earth. The genius of the American project was what connected the shovels to the ocean. The Lidgerwood unloader was the single cleverest piece of equipment most viewers have never heard of. A 3-ton plow was hitched to the rear car of a spoil train. A steel cable as thick as a man's wrist ran from the plow over the tops of the cars to a steam-driven windlass on a flat car at the train's head. When the train arrived at the dump site, the windlass wound in the cable and the plow was dragged forward through the entire train, scraping the dirt off the cars and onto the spoil pile. A 20-car train was cleared in 10 minutes. On the record day, 18 trains, 3.5 miles of cars total, were unloaded in 8 hours. 20 Lidgerwood unloaders, with 120 operators, did the work of 5,666 manual laborers. The Broderick and Bascom Rope Company of St. Louis sent engineers to Panama to fix the cables that kept failing under friction loads. Their redesigned reinforced wire rope became a commercial product line sold across America after the canal. Then there was the track shifter, invented by William G. Beard, the general manager of the Panama Railroad. The first version of the machine moved track 3 feet at a throw. The redesigned version moved it 9 feet in either direction. Fewer than 12 men with one track shifter moved a mile of rail per day, replacing the 600 men it would have taken by hand. The dirt spreader leveled dumped spoil into even layers using compressed air cylinders that tilted steel wings 11.5 feet back from the rails. It did the work of 5,000 to 6,000 manual laborers. About 50 separate improvements were made to the spreader design during construction. Behind all of this sat the Gorgona shops. At peak, Gorgona employed 2,166 men working 16-hour days in August of 1910. They called it the Pittsburgh of the Canal Zone. In 1 month, the Gorgona foundry poured 607,000 pounds of gray iron castings, the all-time record for any canal-era shop. Then, before January of 1914, Gorgona was abandoned. Gatun Lake would drown it. Along with Matachin, Crutis, and Tabernilla, the Pittsburgh of the Canal Zone was evacuated, and the buildings were pulled down. The largest industrial complex in Central America was deliberately flooded as part of the canal's own completion. None of this system would have functioned without 45,000 West Indian laborers on the silver roll. The gold roll was paid in United States gold coins. The silver roll was paid in Panamanian silver. The entire wage system was a segregation mechanism disguised as monetary policy. Drinking fountains and post offices in the Canal Zone were labeled gold and silver, standing side by side. Passenger trains were divided by the baggage car into gold cars for white Americans and silver cars for West Indian laborers. Jackson Smith, the labor chief, designed the housing formula. Each gold roll worker received 1 square foot of housing per $1 of monthly wage, doubled for the married. Silver roll workers received nothing like this. They lived in segregated barracks with dirt floors and no screens. 45,000 Barbadians migrated to Panama between 1904 and 1916, roughly 25% of the working-age male population of the entire island. The total population of Barbados dropped from 200,000 in 1900 to 172,000 by 1910. The SS Ancon arrived at Cristobal on September 2, 1909, carrying 1,500 Barbadian men. They traveled as deckers, meaning they rode exposed on the deck for the full voyage. Spain sent 8,300 workers recruited from Galicia and the Basque Country. Italy sent fewer than 2,000. Stevens had also formally requested 2,500 Chinese laborers with an option for 15,000 more, but Washington refused to approve the contract, and the proposal died before any Chinese worker set foot in Panama. The mortality rate reveals the silver roll system most clearly. In the first half of 1906, the death rate was 17 per thousand for whites and 59 per thousand for non-whites. For the period from 1907 to 1913, the official racial breakdown of deaths ran 19% white at 900 men and 81% colored at 3,788 men. The Culebra Cut consumed them in particular. 9 miles of mountain between Gold Hill and Contractors Hill, 312 feet deep at the maximum. 6,000 men worked the cut simultaneously at peak. The total explosive consumption for the cut alone was 60 million pounds of dynamite. At peak, they detonated 400,000 pounds of explosives per month. They called it Hell's Gorge. The dynamite itself became a weapon without enemies. Iron pyrite in the rock oxidized and produced hot, sulfurous gas that could spontaneously ignite unexploded charges. Lightning strikes caused premature detonations. Steam shovels repeatedly struck live unexploded charges left behind by earlier blasting crews. A steam shovel dug up a bushel of French dynamite from 1887 in September of 1908, with its nitroglycerin gone inert. The Cucaracha slide of October 4th through 12th, 1907, moved 500,000 cubic yards of clay into the cut at an average of 14 feet per day for 10 days, overturning 2 steam shovels. The material was too soft for shovels, so it had to be hydraulically sluiced. Gaillard called it a tropical glacier of mud. When Cucaracha blocked the canal again in January of 1912, Gaillard brought the problem back to Goethals. That was when Goethals gave the famous 2-word reply. 75 acres of the town of Culebra itself eventually slid into the cut. Houses marked with the letter D on the survey maps were dismantled in November of 1910, and houses marked E were moved in January of 1911, as the ground crept toward the edge. The official American-era death figure is 5,609, though some sources list 5,855. Of these, roughly 350 were white Americans, and the balance, around 4,500 Hisard, were non-white silver roll workers, overwhelmingly West Indian. If this is the kind of construction history you want more of, like and subscribe. We publish new episodes every few days, and each one goes this deep or deeper. Now let's look at the individual names that the ledgers preserved. The names matter because the canal's official records preserved some of them and forgot most of the others. Constantine Parkinson was 15 years old, a brakeman on a breakwater rock train, when an accident on July 16, 1913, took his right leg, and crushed his left heel. His grandmother petitioned Goethals directly for compensation, writing that the boy was her only support. Goethals replied that Congress had passed no law authorizing payment to injured silver roll workers. The grandmother received nothing. Wilfred MacDonald was a Jamaican trainman who worked for the Isthmian Canal Commission from 1906 to 1912. He lost both legs in a rail accident. On May 25, 1913, he wrote a letter to Goethals begging for artificial limbs. The letter survives in the National Archives Record Group 185. He signed it, and the signature has been preserved exactly as he wrote it. Truly subordinated cliente. He meant truly subordinate client, the phonetic spelling of a man with no legal education trying to sound formal enough to be heard. He died in obscurity. No artificial limbs were ever provided. The Ancon Hospital surgical audit for 1910 through 1912 recorded 22,000 cases, of which 11,651 were traumatic, 4,639 mining accidents, 804 railroad mishaps, 468 amputations. The A.A. Marks Company of New York supplied more than 200 prosthetic limbs to the Canal Zone by 1912 and marketed a waterproof leg specifically for tropical conditions. In 1963, the Isthmian Historical Society organized a competition for the best true stories of life and work on the Isthmus of Panama. 112 entries arrived, handwritten, mostly from retired West Indian workers. The originals survive today in Box 25 of the Library Museum Panama collection in the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress. Alfred Doughton, a Barbadian, wrote this: "Death was our constant companion. I shall never forget the trainloads of dead men being carted away daily, as if they were just so much lumber." Rufus Edward Ford wrote this: "You turn to work in the morning with a gang about 125 men, and by 11 o'clock you will find about 40 men. All the others fall down with malaria." Albert Bannister, registered silver roll worker number 5876 from Colon, described the Culebra Cut this way: "Today you dig, and it grow tomorrow. Beside it slides every day. The government wash down the hill, give it a bath night and day, until the hill catch cramp, then blast it up with dynamite." Harrigan Austin called the whole system some sort of semi-slavery. Prince Green wrote that most of us came here with the same spirit as a soldier going to war. Albert Peters, a Bahamian who arrived at age 20 in 1906, remembered his first night in the hospital. The man in the next bed died before morning. Peters wrote that he wished he had listened to his parents and never come. Isaiah Bunting closed his essay with this line: "Excuse my writin', because I only have one eyes. I can barely see, but praise God, I am still living." Amos Clark described the opening of work in May of 1904, when white and colored Americans started cutting down jungle together, wearing blue jumpers, khaki pants, and derby hats. The old French workers, he remembered, jumped 2 feet in the air when they learned the Americans had taken over. Those voices stayed in a box in the Library of Congress for decades. Almost no documentary has used them. While the silver roll men worked in the cut, the engineers were completing the 2 other pieces of the canal that the mainstream story usually rushes through: Gatun Dam and the locks. Gatun Dam was the largest earthen dam in the world when it was completed, holding back Gatun Lake, which itself was the largest artificial lake in the world at that time. The dam stretched nearly 1.5 miles across the Chagres Valley and rose 115 feet above sea level. The lake behind it flooded 164 square miles of jungle, including the old Panama Railroad and the towns of Gorgona, Matachin, Cruces, and Tabernilla. The locks were a parallel engineering achievement. 3 sets of locks, Gatun on the Atlantic side, Pedro Miguel and Miraflores on the Pacific side, each built of reinforced concrete and steel. Total concrete used across all 3 lock complexes was 4.5 million cubic yards. Gatun alone consumed 2,046,100 cubic yards. The pouring at Gatun began August 24, 1909, and all 3 lock complexes finished on the same day, September 1, 1900. 13. The cableway system at Gatun was designed by Lidgerwood. 85-foot steel towers stood on both banks of the lock excavation. 2.5-inch steel cables stretched between them, carrying buckets of up to 6 tons of concrete each, fed by a circular electric railroad from 864 cubic-foot concrete mixers. Lieutenant Colonel Harry F. Hodges designed the lock gates themselves. Goethals himself said the canal could not have been built without Hodges, and yet Hodges appears in almost no popular Panama Canal documentary. The entire lock control system, the first major United States government contract ever awarded to General Electric, used GE lock control boards and towing locomotives. Colonel David Dubose Gaillard, who ran the Central Division and therefore ran the Culebra Cut, paid for the canal with his life. He was a West Point graduate, class of 1884. At peak, he commanded 6,000 men and 50 to 60 steam shovels simultaneously. He worked 16-hour days for 7 years. On July 26, 1913, following the worst slides the cut had experienced, Gaillard collapsed. The initial diagnosis was nervous breakdown. He was sent back to the United States, where doctors at Johns Hopkins discovered a brain tumor. He died in Baltimore on December 5, 1913, age 54, 8 months before the canal opened. The Culebra Cut was renamed Gaillard Cut on April 27, 1915. The end came in 2 moments, one famous and one largely forgotten. On October 10, 1913, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, President Woodrow Wilson pressed a telegraph key at the White House. The signal traveled 4,000 miles over a purpose-routed cable path. Washington to Galveston, Texas, 1,556 miles. Galveston to Coatzacoalcos, Mexico, 793 miles. Coatzacoalcos to Salina Cruz, 188 miles. Salina Cruz to San Juan del Sur, Nicaragua, 766 miles. San Juan del Sur to Panama, 718 miles. Panama to the Gamboa Dike, 25 miles. The entire relay took less than 4 seconds. At Gamboa, the signal triggered the detonation of 8,000 pounds of dynamite in 400 bore holes. The final earthen barrier between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans disintegrated in a single white cloud. Wilson, still at his desk in Washington, turned to a reporter and said, "There, it is all over. Gamboa is busted." 20 minutes later, 2 Americans shot the rapids from Gatun Lake into the cut in a dugout canoe. One was a Marine private. The other was Lyndon Bates Jr., a New York attorney who died 18 months later when the Germans sank the Lusitania. The first ship to actually transit the completed canal was not the SS Ancon with its cargo of dignitaries. That was a staged opening. The first ocean-to-ocean passage was the SS Cristobal on August 3, 1914, carrying a load of cement. Goethals deliberately wanted a trial before the world watched, and the cement run was intentionally unpublicized. The SS Ancon followed on August 15, 1914, piloted by Captain John A. Constantine, carrying approximately 200 dignitaries. The transit took 9 hours and 40 minutes. Goethals himself did not ride on the Ancon. He followed the ship along the shore by railcar. The grand international opening ceremony that had been planned was canceled. World War I had erupted in Europe 11 days before the Cristobal's transit. The European powers that were supposed to send warships and dignitaries were now busy killing each other. The canal opened quietly, in the shadow of a larger catastrophe. The Roosevelt Canal Service Medal was authorized by executive order on June 23, 1907. It was designed by Victor D. Brenner, who also designed the 1909 Lincoln Cent. It was struck in bronze at the Philadelphia Mint from exactly 1,000 pounds of French canal scrap. Specifically, the stay bolts from abandoned French equipment. Only 7,423 medals were struck. Bars were awarded for additional 2-year service periods. Only 42 men received the 4th bar for 10 years of service. Gorgas was one of them. The reverse of the medal carries the motto, "The land divided, the world united." The steam shovels themselves had a shorter afterlife than the medal. In 1914, as the European War drove steel prices to record highs, the Panama shovels were sold off as scrap or as industrial equipment. The Chile Exploration Company, controlled by the Guggenheim family, bought a batch and shipped them to Chuquicamata, a copper mine in northern Chile. Production at Chuquicamata began May 18, 1915, with ex-Panama shovels running the pit. Chuquicamata today is the largest open-pit copper mine on Earth. Some shovels stayed closer to home. The Durand brothers, Roy and Russell, bought a surplus Bucyrus 50B in the 1930s and trucked it to Rollinsville, Colorado. They ran it at their Lump Gulch placer operation, 6 miles south of Nederland, until 1978. 65 years after the shovel left the factory in South Milwaukee, it was still digging gold gravel in the Colorado Rockies. The Scottish-built dredge Corozal, the only major non-American piece of heavy equipment on the canal, was authorized only after President Taft personally overrode a congressional American-only rule. Captain James Bartholomew Wallace sailed the Corozal 12,000 miles around Cape Horn in 117 days. 2 French ladder dredges, Badger and Marmot, were rebuilt by the Americans at $35,000 each and put back into service. Today, the hulls of Badger and Marmot are still visible at low tide near Amador Beach under the Bridge of the Americas. If you have stuck with this story this far, we appreciate it. Like and subscribe for more construction history that the mainstream documentaries skip. Now let's finish with the one machine from that era that still stands today. The Marion Model 60 Builders, plate number 1799, was shipped from the Marion Steam Shovel Company in 1904. It was one of the 24 Marion shovels that arrived in Panama, alongside the 77 Bucyrus shovels and the 1 Thew shovel. It worked in the Canal Zone for 10 years, lifting 5 cubic yards of Panamanian rock per bight, powered by 200 pounds of steam pressure, and operated by crews who earned $240 a month at a time when a Barbadian laborer in the same trench earned 25 cents an hour. When the canal was completed and the scrap sales began, the Marion Model 60 did not go to Chile, or to Colorado, or to an American scrapyard. It was purchased by the Costa Rican Northern Railway, which needed a heavy-duty machine for a railroad grading project, and it was shipped north to the town of Turrialba in Costa Rica's Caribbean lowlands. It worked on Costa Rican railway construction for decades after Panama was finished, cutting embankments through Central American jungle that looked very much like the Panamanian jungle it had been built for. Today, it sits at the Omar Salazar Museum on the grounds of the University of Costa Rica campus at Turrialba. The boiler is cold. The cables are gone. The riveted steel sides are painted and preserved. Visitors can walk up to it and touch the dipper that bit into the Culebra Cut more than a century ago. A small plaque in Spanish identifies the machine and its origin, but most visitors pass it without realizing what they are looking at. This is the only shovel from the Panama Canal with fully documented provenance that still exists anywhere in the world. Out of the 102 machines that dug the canal, this one remains. The rest were scrapped, buried, sold overseas, or forgotten. The Villa Dingler, where 4 coffins passed through the door in 12 months, was torn down in the 1920s. The town of Gorgona, where 2,166 men worked 16-hour shifts in the shops, called the Pittsburgh of the Canal Zone, lies at the bottom of Gatun Lake. The canal itself still carries nearly 5% of global maritime trade. 15,000 ships pass through every year. Each one rises 85 feet from the Atlantic to the lake and descends back down on the Pacific side, exactly as Lieutenant Colonel Harry F. Hodges designed the system in 1908. Stevens' railroad insight that it was a transportation problem and not a digging problem built the canal. Goethals' military command that when the mountain fell, they would dig it out again, drove it to completion. Gorgas's war on the mosquito that dropped mortality by 99.9%, kept enough of the workforce alive to finish. Gallard's 7 years in the cut killed him at 54. Wilfred MacDonald's letter, signed with the phonetic formality of a man begging for artificial legs, never got a reply. 22,000 French dead are buried in the hillsides above the cut. 5,609 American-era dead are recorded in the official ledgers, with the real number likely double that. 45,000 Barbadians left their island for Panama. Most never returned. The ones who did live into old age wrote their stories down in 1963 in essays that sat in a Library of Congress box for decades, describing a world where trainloads of dead men were carted away like lumber. The Marion Model 60 at Turrialba is what remains. One machine out of 102, a single piece of cast iron and riveted steel, preserved behind a rope on a Costa Rican university campus, standing for the entire system that cut a continent in half. Like and subscribe for more stories about the machines and the men who built our modern world.